we'd like to ask, and we will ask those in an order that we've sort of agreed beforehand. We're conscious that time is very tight, so we will try to get through as much as we possibly can this morning. So, obviously we're very interested in a range of issues across the department, and particularly interested, Baroness Smith, in the work that you're going to be doing. So thank you very much for being able to come along today. It's very, very helpful. So I wondered if I could begin by asking, we've heard that there is an intention that the Scotland office would like to reset the UK government's relationship with the Scottish government. So how would your approach, Secretary of State, differ from that of your predecessor, for example?
Well, good morning, Chair, and congratulations on your chairwomanship of this committee. It's very much welcomed, and congratulations to everyone who's on the committee. I know the elections were hard fought within the Labour side anyway, so it's nice that you've got the committee up and running, and it's a great delight to be here in my first evidence session as the Secretary of State, and you see the team, the wonderful team we've assembled here in the Scotland office. Excuse me, resetting the relationship's the key thing that's happened since the general election. The First Minister and the Prime Minister met within 48 hours of the government being formed in Butte House. There was a long discussion about common issues and common goals, and the key message that came from that was that both the Prime Minister and the First Minister were clear that resetting the relationship was the way that both governments deliver on their common agendas and on their own agendas in government. That resetting has been clear. The Prime Minister has been clear with the Secretaries of State and Ministers. The First Minister has been clear with Cabinet Secretaries and Scottish Government Ministers. And everybody's been working very closely together on that common agenda. Of course, you can't syringe the politics out of that. We wouldn't expect that to be the case. I think if I was to put that forward as a proposition, you wouldn't believe me in any case. But it's a really close working relationship. To give you an example, I've met with the Deputy First Minister 5 times now. I've met with the First Minister on 4 separate occasions, including events that we've done jointly. I have a tremendous relationship with other Cabinet Secretaries. We've been working very closely with Gillian Martin as the Cabinet Secretary for Energy on common issues around GB Energy and Grangemouth, for example. So that resetting the relationship is very clear. It's something that's working very well. And it's not just at political and government level. I think that message is filtered down through civil society, through business, through third sector organisations, that we are very keen to work together, and that will only benefit the people of Scotland.
I wonder if you could then describe what you think the relationship would look like were it to be successfully reset, and what success would actually be.
Well, it's about delivery, I suppose. I mean, if I give you an example, our GB Energy mission, which is one of the key missions of the Labour government in terms of getting to that clean power by 2030, that can only be done by both governments working together. Of course, there's devolved and reserved issues that are involved in that, whether it be consenting or planning. Energy is reserved and devolved in certain aspects of it, and therefore resetting that relationship means that we have to work together to deliver those common aims. There's some great examples already of where it has worked. We worked together to bring the Commonwealth Games back to Glasgow in 2026. That was a joint endeavour between both governments. In the first weekend of taking office, we worked very closely together to jointly fund Project Willow, which is about the future of the Grangemouth site. And that was a very important project to get up and running and fund jointly. So it's about delivery, and resetting that relationship is both about making sure we can deliver for the people of Scotland, but also, on the other hand, making sure that people can see both governments working together. Very conscious, Chair, of all the polling that has been done both publicly and otherwise before the election and over the last few years that shows that Scottish people just want both governments, regardless of what colour they are, to work together. That's what we're determined to do.
Thank you. Flynn?
Yes, so thank you, Chair. Good morning to you all, and congratulations, Baroness Smith, on your well-deserved role. Secretary of State, just in relation to that, and notwithstanding the points you've made, which are accurate in terms of the number of meetings and so on and so forth, do you think that giving the Scottish Government 19 minutes notice of the plan to reduce funding for the winter fuel allowance reflected a resetting of relations?
Well, if you wouldn't mind me saying to the Honourable Gentleman that our relationship with the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister and the Scottish Government is probably slightly better than your own in this moment in time. So, we have worked very, very closely together. And look, the way in which the fiscal statements work, of course, there's a lot of market-sensitive information in there. And the Scottish Government, and indeed Shona Robinson as the Finance Secretary, was given all the information that was in the budget at the time of which it could be given. In fact, it was given at about the same time it was given to Cabinet as well, the wider Cabinet. So, yes, these things are quite difficult. I would hope perhaps that the Scottish Government might reciprocate and give us some of the information about the Scottish budget that's happening on the early part of December, in order for us to be able to see what we can do as well to work together on those things. So it isn't a discourtesy. Actually, what we've tried to do is make sure that enough and as much information as possible can go in a timely manner. Of course, everything's market sensitive, so really the budget isn't delivered until the Chancellor gets to her feet. And those fiscal statements are incredibly difficult to try and make sure enough information goes out that isn't market sensitive, that could be that could end up in a public domain that would be detrimental to the country. And therefore it's not discourteous in that sense, on the basis that we gave all the information that we could. I was on those meetings as well at the time we could give it. And we'll continue to work on how we can improve those processes through FISC, and the Chief Secretary of the Treasury has given that commitment that we'll look to try and improve those processes where we can.
On the same thing? Yeah. Okay.
I totally accept what the Secretary of State is saying in that regard, but surely he would recognise that where a benefit is under the likely devolved control of the Scottish Government, 90 minutes notices to the withdrawal of that funding does not represent a respect agenda, and surely if they're going to be in the position of trying to reset relations going forward, some sort of adjustment needs to be made which recognises the fact that the Scottish Parliament does have responsibilities that it needs to exercise, but of course much of the financial levers rest with his own government here in London. And do you think that those processes can and should be better in future to stop decisions like that impacting upon Scotland's Parliament?
Well, I mean, devolution works best when both governments work together. That's quite clear. But, as I've already said, market-sensitive information has to be given at the time it has to be given, and that is maximised the way it can be. For the budget, for example, we met with Shona Robinson via Zoom, the Chief Secretary and I, and went through the entire budget with her about 2 hours before the budget was given. It might have even been longer than that. That certainly would have been much, much earlier than many people would have seen the budget, and we had a long and productive discussion. It was welcomed by the Finance Secretary. So we will try and improve these processes. Of course, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury wants to improve them where it can be improved, but the nature of a budget is that there will be market-sensitive information there that can only be given at the time that the budget's actually sealed down and able to be given.
Elaine, did you want to come in on this one?
Yeah. Well, given the Scottish Office's remit is to promote Scotland's devolution, that means that our two parliaments with separate responsibilities. Does the Secretary of State think that double jobbing should be confined to the past and our residents deserve more?
Well, I mean, the Scottish Parliament can essentially put together the rules and regulations of which they want to do. I know individual parties do that as well. Double jobbing is something that I would find incredibly difficult. There's not enough time in the day to do one job, let alone two, particularly if we want to represent our constituents properly as well. So I would have thought that double jobbing is something that we would want to make sure doesn't happen. Has, of course, happened in the past, but, everyone sitting around this table will know how difficult it is to be a constituency MP, let alone having other responsibilities as well. So yes, I would have thought that the Scottish Parliament may want to look at that, and I know that the UK Parliament are looking at it because it's a Labour Party policy. It was in our manifesto.
Thank you. So it's now your question anyway, Elaine. So if you want to come in.
Labour's 2024 election manifesto committed to the strength of the Seoul Convention. By setting up a new memorandum of understanding, what steps have been taken towards this?
May I pass on to Baroness Smith, who is our fantastic new Advocate General for Scotland and is steeped in Seoul.
Is that okay? Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to give evidence this morning. I really welcome the opportunity to introduce myself to the committee, and I hope in due course get a chance to introduce my role as well. I'm discovering as I make my way through Westminster that not everyone is completely across the role of Advocate General for Scotland, and it does seem to be quite unique and quirky. So I would welcome the opportunity this morning to set it out. And it does provide some context for Seoul, so perhaps we'll get into that a little bit more later on. But I think The first part of the answer is that the government is completely committed to the Seoul Convention. It's a manifesto commitment to strengthen it. Work on that is already underway and actually quite well advanced. We are drafting a memorandum of understanding, which we hope to be in a position very soon to present to the Scottish Government, and that's a principled document, as you might expect, but it's seeking to really entrench actually what I think is a lot of what's going on already in practice. There is a lot that I can see works very well, and a lot of it is actually under the radar. At official level, there is incredibly good cooperation and negotiation. There are numerous pieces of legislation that require to butt up against the Seoul Convention, and actually there's an awful lot of under-the-radar stuff going on that's working very, very well, and that's actually my main takeaway since I've been in the role, and it's incredibly heartening. But these are the unsung heroes, of course, the lawyers and the officials that are quietly working away. So it's really, from my perspective anyway, what I want to do is build on that foundation and have that reflected in the memorandum of understanding, so that's almost recognised. So there's a large extent to which what I hope the strengthening Seoul means is actually consolidating what is already going on incredibly well. So that's certainly where I'm coming from on it. Obviously there are political elements to it which aren't part of my role, but that's where I am on it.
Lynn, you've got a follow-up?
On the back of that, what role does the Scotland office play in ensuring effective engagement with the Scottish Government before introducing legislation that engaged the Convention?
I think there's two parts to that. I'll let Ian step in if he wants. Scotland Office has a role, which no doubt Ian's better placed to set out than I am, and I suppose my office's role is a bit more technical and probably follows on from that. But what we do is we work with the bill ministers and the bill departments that are creating the Westminster legislation. Right from the policy end of it through to the legislation, but to make sure that there's a proper understanding of the legal aspects of it that affect Scotland, but the policy aspects of it are more Ian's domain than mine.
I suppose, Chair, there's two parts to this. There's the first part, which is the technical legal side of the way the Seoul Convention operates in terms of legislation, legislative consent motions, etc. And then there's the political side, and of course that butts up against it. And I suppose it goes back to the answer to the first question. If we are working properly together as governments, it makes the Seoul Convention almost redundant. It should be something that comes in as a last resort and not up front. So legislative consent motions should be relatively straightforward if the work is done and the relationship is working before Seoul has to kick in. I'll give you some examples of where actually it's working really well at the moment. The Scottish Government have actually asked the UK Government to legislate in devolved areas in pieces of legislation that's going through here that would have ordinarily been reserved. The Renters Reform Bill being one of those, the Rail Regulation Bill being another, vapes and Tobacco Bill, which will be back in the House again shortly. So there are areas where we've been working together where the Seoul Convention has actually not been required because the Scottish Government have said, you're doing a piece of legislation that we agree with, please could you just extend the scope of that into Scotland. I would hope that relationship would continue to work on that basis. But there's a technical way in which the Advocate General looks after, which is a really, really important constitutional way of looking after the Seoul Convention, but there's also the politics of it that can be dealt with by working closer together.
If I may, Chair. So I think in terms of thinking about the relationship between the governments, there's the reset, which we can think of as a process, but we can also think of it as an attitude and a habit of mind, and the sincerity of that reset will obviously be tested by its depth and duration. But to give some sort of indication of how committed we are to it, good legislation will be a product not just of collaboration and conversation between the two governments, between Scottish stakeholders more widely, which is why the Secretary of State and I have, between us, had 108 different stakeholder meetings just in the first 3 months in office. So when we're talking and thinking about the reset, yes, we can of course think about the technical elements of the Seoul Convention and otherwise, but I'd really urge the committee and in your deliberations going forward to think about how are we engaging the Scottish taxpayer and the Scottish public more widely, and that's something we've been very committed to do, thinking of the reset not just between two governments but with Scotland writ large.
Stephen, did you want to continue?
Yeah, of course. We once agreed that the Internal Market Act undermined that principle of consent. Does that agreement still exist?
Well, the UK Internal Market Act is being reviewed as well, but there's a commitment in the Act itself for it to be looked at in next year. But in the meantime, what we're looking at is the way it operates. I think the First Minister was very clear that the principle of the UK Internal Market Act is there. It's quite clearly what it is supposed to be there, but the operation of it has not been entirely clear. And there'll be a set of proposals coming out shortly that shows that it can be looked at in terms of the way the processes work, but there is that commitment to consult and to look at how the Act's operating in 2025, and that's what we're committed to see through.
Elaine, I think it's your question next.
Yes, to Secretary of State, it's regarding the Council and Nations and Regions. So how will the Council of the Nations and Regions fit into the existing system of the intergovernmental systems?
Yeah, well, the intergovernmental relations infrastructure is indeed complex, but it's been built up over a number of years to deal with various issues, just to make sure that people actually know what's happening, and common interests and common goals can be looked at across both governments' infrastructures. The Council of the Nations and Regions was a commitment by the Prime Minister in our manifesto to bring together the moralities of the regions of England with the First Ministers of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. We had our first Committee of the Nations and Regions in Scotland in Queen Elizabeth House in Edinburgh last month. Hugely successful for people to get round the table to talk about what is most relevant to them. The theme of the first Council of the Nations and Regions was about investment, because the International Investment Summit was that Monday, and set the scene for the nations and regions playing a key role in economic growth across the country, driving that inward investment, making sure we can get growth in all four corners of the country, and showing that growth is actually a responsibility of every level of government, as well as the UK government driving that mission, that national mission. So the Council of the Nations and Regions is the Prime Minister's commitment to making sure that the nations and regions have a seat around the table, have influence around the table, can have common goals and common discussions, and come to common conclusions about things, and it worked really well, the first one, and I look forward to the next one in April.
And just to ask again, Secretary of State, why the Scottish Council leaders were not invited to the first Council of the Nations and Regions meeting in Edinburgh, and will this continue to be the case moving forward?
Yes, well, look, the manifesto commitment is very clear. It was for the nations and regions, the moralities of England. If there's a region of England or an area of England that doesn't have a mayoral structure, there's been an offer put out by MHCLG for them to set up a structure wherein they would be involved in the Council of Nations and Regions. It was set up for the First Minister to be involved in that, to have direct access and direct discussions with the Prime Minister on that committee-type basis. So there are other structures in place for the Council of Local Authorities, Scottish Local Authorities and individual local authorities, particularly through the growth deals and the regional growth partnerships, to come together. So there's a whole host of intergovernmental relation bodies that Scottish local government will be in, but I would hope that the First Minister, as the representative of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government on that body, would seek the views of COSLA and other local authorities and take their views to the Council of Nations and Regions, essentially as their representative as well as their figurehead in the Council of Nations and Regions.
And if I could just add on that, Chair, so myself and the Secretary of State have had 2 meetings with the COSLA presidency, further one on budget day with myself. I think COSLA know they have an open door to the Scotland office, and we'd be delighted to continue dialogue with them. It may not be through that structure, but I think they know they have an open door.
And just my final question, if I may, Chair, to Secretary of State. So the Prime Minister announced a new envoy for the nations and regions role last month. Really just to ask why this position is necessary, and with the role now vacant, are there plans to fill it?
There's no plans to fill it, no.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think we're going to move on to a couple of questions for the Advocate General. So I'll ask Douglas to ask the first one. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Baroness Smith, and my congratulations to you on your appointment. Advocate General, earlier in your evidence this morning, you indicated you welcomed the opportunity of setting out your role. Can I ask you to do that, and may I begin with perhaps the obvious opening question: what are your priorities as Advocate General for Scotland?
Well, if you'll forgive me, I might just set out the role first. Is that okay? Because I'm not convinced that certainly every citizen in the country knows what it is. It may be that this committee does, and I, of course, know the Chair has got long experience in many matters that we'll have touched on the Advocate General. But if I may just set it out, I think that would be of assistance. So I am, of course, Government Minister, but I'm also a Law Officer of the Crown. I'm one of the UK's 3 law officers alongside the Attorney General and Solicitor General for England. What it means, though, to be the Advocate General is to be the principal legal advisor on Scots law and the Scottish devolution settlement. I think structurally it's important to understand that I'm not part of the Attorney's Office. I am not his deputy. But equally I'm not part of Scotland Office either. I sit alone in a rather quirky government department, I think. But it means that I am separate from all government departments, which of course is important because I'm required to advise them. So I'm, as a minister, responsible for the Office of the Advocate General. The vast majority of my staff provide litigation services to represent the UK government in the Scottish courts and indeed the Supreme Court. This is primarily the Home Office, Department for Work and Pensions, HMRC. But also a big function is to provide advice to UK government departments, as I mentioned, and that, as we were discussing earlier, is right from the policy formation stage to try and ensure that Scotland's interests are properly taken account of in the formation of policy, that we don't end up in a situation where a policy is coming to the legislative end and Scotland hasn't been properly thought of. So my team engage with government departments on that basis, but then of course when it comes to the legislative part of it, continue to engage again to ensure that Scotland's interests and Scottish law is properly accounted for and doesn't become a bolt-on to legislation, which is obvious what problems that can bring. I have separate responsibilities as a law officer and as one of the 3 UK law officers. I sit, for example, on the Parliamentary Business and Legislative Committee, which assesses the readiness of legislation to be presented to Parliament. And my role in there is as a law officer, and I have the same position as the Attorney General, for example, in terms of asking questions, scrutinising, and indeed not giving consent to a piece of legislation going forward. And that's whether or not it has either an issue relating to Scotland or indeed whether it even relates to Scotland at all. So in those functions, I'm primarily concerned with respecting, protecting and upholding the rule of law, which is something that a view that I share with the Attorney General has not been respected as well as it ought to have been in recent years, and we're keen to press yet another reset button in respect of that, and that's about a whole host of rather technical things around delegated powers, which I won't get into just now, but they're actually very important. So quite a lot of my time is spent on that. I have statutory functions in respect of the devolution settlement, and are required to keep an eye on the legislative competence, of course, of both parliaments. There is one thing I did want to mention as well. I'm sure the committee will be aware that there is a long-standing convention that the existence and content of law officers' advice is generally not disclosed out with government. So I'm delighted to appear again before this committee, should you invite me, but I should just make it clear that any advice that I've given to ministerial colleagues may limit my contribution, so it's just to lay down that marker. Now, you asked me what my priorities were, so I'm going to get to that. So I think really 3 priorities. The first I've already mentioned, which is upholding the rule of law, and that is in a general sense in terms of good legislation going through Parliament, but it's also more particularly about protecting Scotland's interests, and I do feel that my role on the Parliamentary Business and Legislative Committee is quite a powerful one. It's not a particularly big committee. Ministers require to come to that committee and present their bill, and it allows me the opportunity to discuss whether or not the devolution analysis has been adequate, what more needs to be done, and indeed allows me the opportunity to speak directly to the Minister. what I'm saying at, I think, literally every committee meeting is that the devolved nations need to be taken account of early on in policy formation and in the legislative process. So I'm beating a drum and I'm doing it on a regular basis, and whilst there is very good engagement at an official level, as I've mentioned, I do think it's important to raise it up to that ministerial as well, and that's something that I've got the opportunity to do. I'm also keen to contribute to the reset of the relationships between the governments, and I think, again, if we legislate well together and our officials can work well together, then that will assist. And I suppose, as a sort of sub-point of that, my third mission is to have a good relationship with the law officers in Scotland and indeed anyone else based in Scotland. So the Advocate General has traditionally spent a lot of time in London, and I have been and plan to spend less time in London. I've based myself out of Queen Elizabeth House in Edinburgh. That's a deliberate choice, and that reflects my own view that if you're representing the needs of the people of Scotland, then you should be rooted in Scotland and connected to people in Scotland. That includes the law officers of Scotland. My first external engagement was to meet the Lord Advocate. That's not an accident. That was a deliberate demonstration that is part of the reset of the relationships. And I met with her and the Solicitor General and had an excellent meeting at which she made it clear to me that she was looking forward to working together differently than she had had the opportunity to work with law officers before, and I welcomed that very much. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
Yes, please, Chair, and thank you, Advocate General, for that very full answer. And in that answer, you've explained very clearly in my mind how your office sits alone and separately, but I was very interested to hear your second and third priorities in relation to resetting relationships and your good relationships with the Scottish law officers. So really following on from that, how do the UK and Scottish law officers work together, and have you done anything to change this working relationship in any way since entering office?
Well, I hope I signalled at the start that I intend it to be different, and I said that clearly at that meeting, and as I say, a certain view was reflected back to me. I think I probably want to pick up on what Kirsty McNeill was saying, which is it's ultimately about actions, not words, I think. And I have a role to play in ensuring that once things come to my department to implement, so I'm not obviously involved in the politics of it, but when something comes to my department, what I have learned, as I said earlier, is that actually there's an awful lot that can be resolved by lawyers and officials working together quietly to find the way through what is initially a disagreement about for example, where competence lies, and finding a route through. And there are numerous, I think there's been over 200 pieces of legislation where legislative consent motions have been granted and very few where they've not. So I think that actually it's a really good news story in any event, and what I've tried to do is to signal that that's absolutely the direction of travel that I think my department should be taking, and that's the role that we can play.
Very much, Advocate General. Thank you, Chair.
Good morning, Advocate General, and I'd like to offer my congratulations on your appointment. Just picking up on the reset theme that you've just discussed as a priority, we've seen increasing recourse to the courts in recent years to solve intergovernmental disputes. What do you think that says about the recent state of intergovernmental relationships?
So I'm grateful for that question, because I think it allows me to set out a bit of clarity about some of the court actions, because I regret to say I don't really agree with the premise of the question. So I don't think the courts have been used to resolve disputes between governments. And if I might just set it out a little bit, I think it would be assistance for this committee to understand it. Some of the more high-profile cases have been individuals bringing cases against government. So the committee will be familiar with the Miller cases, Cherry cases, Whiteman. That is not a government-on-government dispute, and it's not the courts adjudicating between governments in an adversarial way. References to the Supreme Court from the Scotland Act equally are not government-on-government disputes that the courts are adjudicating between. They are a mechanism within the Scotland Act which allows governments to refer a question for clarification to the Supreme Court. And in my view, doing so, whether it comes from the Scottish Government or from the UK Government, is an entirely appropriate use of a mechanism that was legislated for in the Scotland Act. I think it is wrong to view that as one government against another. Each government comes to the adjudicator, presents their argument, and the mechanism allows the court to provide clarity. So I think it's unhelpful to characterise it as the disputes between governments and the court, and indeed the court stepping in to adjudicate on them. Now, of course, individuals can bring any litigation that they want, but my own view is that actually there's been relatively little. We've had 25 years of the devolution settlement, and I actually think that the small number of cases, relatively speaking, speaks to a very robust piece of legislation really working very well. And if we look at it from the other point of view, let's imagine there had not been any cases, no individuals taking cases, or no references to the Supreme Court. One might imagine that that was just really rather odd, considering the seismic nature of the changes that devolution brought about. So I think it's a system working well, is the short answer.
Thank you very much for that, and I do appreciate the distinction that you've drawn between individuals bringing forward cases, and also the point you make about it being a legitimate mechanism that is there to be used effectively. However, in 2023, the then Scotland Secretary used Section 35 of the Scotland Act to block Scotland's Gender Recognition Reform Bill, and a very high-profile case. Can I ask you what your assessment of the previous government's use of Section 35 in this case?
Well, for my part, I'm a lawyer and a law officer, so it's there in the Act to be used if one wishes to do so. I think it's probably a slightly more political question, so if with the consent of the Chair, I might ask Ian to take that one. I think I'm straying out with my brief.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, we sort of cross between the politics and the legal here in terms of the Section 35. I mean, just to emphasise what Baroness Smith has said, the very fact that Section 35 had never been used before in the 25 years of devolution actually shows the strength of the Scotland Act in terms of its operation. And what the Section 35 was doing was asking the courts to determine whether or not it was lawful to use Section 35 of the Scotland Act in order to determine whether or not a question of cross-border issues arose. And of course the Supreme Court did respond with saying it was lawful to use it. So that shows from a legal perspective that actually the system works. Now, there'll be arguments about the policies and the politics of that, but the actual legal mechanisms in terms of that dispute resolution operate correctly. Was it the right thing to do in terms of the previous government using it? I have said clearly we won't lift the Section 35 order that was put in place on that basis, and it's probably a question for the previous government in terms of whether or not they should have used it, but it's a political question for them, not a legal question for us.
Okay, I think you might have answered my next question already. Will the government's approach to Section 35 differ from the previous government's?
Well, the primary role of the Scotland Office is to uphold the constitutional settlement, and the constitutional settlement contains Section 35 as it contains all the other sections that are in the Act. It's a relatively obvious thing to say. But I suppose the direct answer to that question is that Minister McNeill and I are in the Scotland Office and want to look to the future, not the past. All the answers we've given already to resetting the relationship, to the priorities that we have as a Scotland Office, is all about making sure we can deliver the UK government's manifesto and our promises and our missions. That means that we have to work very closely together with the Scottish Government. They're of the same view, and therefore, the use of a Section 35 is at the end of a process. I would hope that the answers that you've heard from the Advocate General, from Minister McNeill and myself so far in this committee would assure you that we would do everything in our power to make sure that nothing got to that stage, and that means that we need Cabinet Secretaries and Secretaries of State working very closely together across all departments on issues of common interest, but also, of course, there'll be differences. That's the way asymmetric devolution works, but we have to work through those carefully, and we have to make sure we're doing the right thing by the Scottish people.
Thank you. Susan Murray.
Thank you very much, and first of all I'd like to thank you all for coming and congratulate Baroness Smith, but also to say that it's been really heartening to hear of the approach of working together and building on what's already working. So I'd just like to ask how the Secretary of State thinks the Department will achieve its long-term priorities and how these differ from those of your predecessor.
And congratulations to you on your election back in July. Well, we have 4 key priorities. We've reshaped the department, and our Director, Laurence, Rockey, may wish to add something to this, but we've got 4 main priorities. The first one being economic growth, which is the national mission, of course, of the UK Labour Government as well, but I think UK Labour Government's mission of growth is shared with the Scottish Government as well. In fact, it's indeed shared with many other governments across the world, and that's to make sure that we can deliver that growth in all 4 corners of the UK, but also in all regions of Scotland as well. It's really important for that to be the case. Our second one is in green energy. Our mission for clean power by 2030 is a key one. Scotland will play a critical role in the delivery of that. That means jobs, it means lower bills, it means making sure that we can have that transition away from fossil fuels, and that's a key priority of the Scotland Office. We will provide and do provide and want to provide that window to Whitehall for the industry, but also for the issues that are coming in, whether they be related to DEFRA or DESNES in this particular case. And we've already shown that we can pull people together and use that convening power to drive some of this forward. GB Energy, of course, will be headquartered in Aberdeen South. In terms of the constituency it will be in, that's been capitalised in the budget with £125 million to get it up and running and set up, and of course the overall capitalisations into the billions, £7.3 billion. So that's a key priority of the Scotland Office. The third key priority is Brand Scotland. We've spent the last 25 years selling Scotland to Scots. It's now time we sold Scotland to the world. We've got some tremendous door openers in terms of our soft power, but we've also got some tremendous opportunities in terms of our goods and services. And wherever you go in the world, you'll know this, and you say you're from Scotland, that in itself is a great door opener. So we should be exploiting that, working with our colleagues in DBT and FCDO to make sure our international networks are selling Scotland. But we have £750,000 allocated to us in the budget that's just passed to drive Brand Scotland forward as a Scotland Office, and that's a huge step forward, and we're very much looking forward to doing that. We're in Southeast Asia next week, in Malaysia and Singapore, and we were in Norway looking at common interests of energy and defence just 2 weeks ago. So that Brand Scotland thing is very much a priority. And the fourth one's a key priority that Minister McNeill and I share passionately, is the anti-poverty priority, which feeds into the other 3 priorities of the Scotland Office as well. So we're reshaping the whole of the department. The whole of government is behind these priorities. We'll be working hand in glove with other government departments. We had the Delivering for Scotland board yesterday, where all government departments come together and see what their contribution can be to delivering for Scotland on those 4 priorities. It was a very constructive meeting, and we look forward to achieving many of the goals that we have as a department.
Thanks for that. So what are the main levers that the Scotland Office has to deliver that?
Well, the key things are that the Prime Minister has been pretty clear that Scotland will be at the heart of this new UK Labour Government. We want to achieve the national missions, the UK national missions that were set out in our manifesto, but also those have to be achieved across the whole of the country. Growth has to be in all 4 corners of the country. It can't just be concentrated in the southeast. where we've had a problem before. The Prime Minister has been very clear it's very easy to create growth in the South East. What is more difficult is creating growth in all our communities right across the country. So in order to do that, we all have to work together. The Scotland Office has a very strong convening power, bringing people together. The Delivering for Scotland board yesterday is a key component of that, but also being industry, societies, institutionals and government's window to Whitehall, so we can provide that ability. We're a very nimble department, so we can be talking to people. We've got great relationships across Whitehall. That's being seen already in industry in terms of our green agenda. So there's a real drive to make sure that this is cross-government at Whitehall, but also cross-society in terms of Scotland. And the 108 meetings that we've already held with stakeholders that Minister McNeill pointed out earlier is a key driver of that.
So I think in some ways you've started to answer my final question, but as in your first statement as Secretary of State, you said that you would make this sure that the Scotland Office has a strong voice for Scotland within the UK government. I think you've already started to outline that, but how will you achieve that, and do you feel you've already started to achieve that?
I can give you some practical examples. We already managed to get both the Scottish and UK governments to jointly fund Project Willow, which is about the future of the Grangemouth site. We worked with the Scottish Government and our colleagues in Treasury and MHCLG to get the Falkirk and Grangemouth growth deal over the line before the budget. We have a very strong voice within the budget, the largest single settlement of the Scottish Government in the history of devolution, £1.5 billion this year and £3.4 billion next year. That's been a very, very strong case we put to the Treasury. We did get our £750,000 for Brand Scotland, so we're being very influential across putting the case. But the key thing here, I think, is delivery. It's all easy to talk about the things that we do, the Commonwealth Games being another example of working very closely with FCDO and DCMS, with the Scottish Government, of course. But those real-life examples of the impacts of the stuff that the Scotland Office does is felt in Scottish society. For example, our New Deal for Working People has a disproportionate benefit to Scots because more Scots are on 0 hours contracts, for example. So we've already achieved so much in the last 4 or 5 months, but with our priorities and the direction of travel of the Scotland Office, we've got so much more to achieve.
Thank you very much.
Angus MacDonald wants to come in this area too.
I'm Secretary of State. I've been trying for a long time to come and see you, but your assistant says you're not available for several months, so I'm thrilled to have you here. My issue, as you will know, is community benefits from renewable energy. And Scotland, when the wind blows, will be producing by 2030 10 times the amount of energy it requires. Mm-hmm. We have the highest level of fuel poverty in rural Scotland. Mm-hmm. We have an elderly population. We have a significant depopulation. We pay far more for our energy prices than the rest of the UK. And GB Energy despite a lot of people trying, would make no mention of community benefit or community ownership of renewables in it. And a lot of us are very concerned that this bonanza of renewables will pass rural Scotland by without any significant benefits. Could you give some reassurance to the committee that this is a priority for the Scottish Office?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Just for the record, Chair, we have met twice previously. It's the third meeting that we've struggled to get back into the diary. But this is a key part of what GB Energy has to achieve, because the way to unlock the future of energy in the Scottish context is to unlock that community benefit and what that means. Just for the record as well, the reason that GB Energy doesn't contain the provisions around community energy and those kinds of community ownership things is because the bill's to be very straightforward in terms of what it's trying to deliver. There are other bits that will come later, including the Secretary of State's strategy that fits into Section 5 of the GB Energy Act, so that will contain all of the issues that you're raising, and I think the Energy Minister Michael Shanks has made that commitment both publicly in the House and indeed directly. But that community energy is there because a lot of our communities in rural Scotland have the natural resources. They will be asked to take the infrastructure in the national interest, and therefore they need that community benefit. We see it working in other places. I was in Shetland at the Viking wind farm and seeing what's been done there. Torquil Crichton, the minister for the member for the Western Isles, is trying to do exactly the same on the Western Isles in terms of the contribution that they will make to the national interest in terms of meeting our mission of clean power by 2030. So it's very much at the top of the agenda. We're working very closely with Desnes, the Secretary of State and the Minister. Michael Shanks, as a Scottish Labour MP, of course, was a very deliberate appointment to make sure that our Scottish Minister was in charge of our energy because of the contribution Scotland will make. So it's very much alive and active, both industry and government discussion, and if we can crack the community benefit issue, I think it will unlock a lot of the benefits that both rural communities will get from hosting the energy infrastructure, but also the benefits the country will get from having that clean power target by 2030.
Thank you.
Justif.
I was just about to say that we actually do intend to ask a number of questions about GB Energy in the course of today's discussion, so I maybe wouldn't preempt that too much just now. We'll perhaps just come to that when it's natural to do so, if that's okay. But Stephen, you wanted in on this area?
Yeah, the Secretary of State, if I was listening correctly, said his fourth and personal mission, along with the Minister, is in relation to reducing poverty. I think all of us can agree with that. His government colleague announced or revealed last night that an additional 100,000 people across the UK will be put into poverty as a result of the UK government's decision to withhold winter fuel payments for pensioners across the UK. How many of those pensioners will be put into poverty in Scotland?
I think I'm familiar with the report that the DWP produced yesterday. Was that the
it's a letter that the Secretary of State produced.
Let's, for the benefit of the committee, the analysis that DWP have done didn't include the triple lock, it didn't include the household support fund, and didn't include the massive increase in uptake of pension credit. So the figures on that I would challenge in terms of the overall analysis, because one of the key things that this government has done is protect the triple lock. That was worth £900 this April. It'll be worth £473, I think it is, next April. And that's a long-term commitment from this government to make sure we can maintain the triple lock, which is another £1,700 across the end of the Parliament. So looking at these figures in isolation I don't think are helpful. But I think the published 100,000 that you talk about is actually not including those three big elements of support for not just our poorest pensioners but all pensioners.
With all due respect, Secretary of State, I'm referring to your own government colleague's letter, and the question was quite simple. If there's 100,000 pensioners in the UK who are going to be getting pushed into poverty, how many of those are in Scotland? I assume as the Secretary of State for Scotland you asked your colleagues.
Well, the reason that I don't have a figure to give you on that basis is because the 100,000 doesn't include the other stuff that the government's doing. So I wouldn't like the Honourable Gentleman to fearmonger that people are being pushed into poverty without having the actual figures. Now, if it doesn't include the triple lock, which is worth that £900 April pass and £473 next April, doesn't include the household support fund and doesn't include the massive uptake in pension credit, I'd be dubious about coming up with figures that don't include the full picture of the funding that we're giving to support pensioners.
So the Secretary of State is making reference to the state pension triple lock, which does increase, but for 75% of pensioners who sit on the old form of the state pension rather than the new state pension, that's not the figure that they would receive. So I think you should probably be a little bit more transparent in relation to the differential there. However, with all due respect, Secretary of State, it's me asking the questions. With regards to the winter fuel payment, can he confirm that he will now go and ask his colleagues in government how many people in Scotland are going to be pushed into poverty as a result of the decisions of his government?
Well, I mean, obviously the decision to means test the winter fuel payment in Scotland was made by his own government as well in terms of the Scottish Government's position. But on that basis, I think that if we're going to look at figures and analyse figures properly, particularly in terms of the baseline for poverty or other socio-economic figures in this country, we need to do it with the whole picture so that we don't end up legislating or putting in public policy that means we're dealing with the wrong issues, and that baseline figure in my view is incorrect because it doesn't take into account some of the major things.
Your own colleague in government.
Some of the major public policy issues that this government already put in place: the triple lock, the household support fund, and the massive increases in pension credit. If you don't include those figures, you end up in a situation where you're dealing with a baseline that is incorrect, and therefore could end up putting policy in place that deals with the wrong thing. If I can just reflect on the fact that the Child Poverty Task Force has been set up by the Secretaries of State of Education and the Department of Work and Pensions. And the key thing for that task force is to start with a proper baseline of what poverty is and how you deal with that particular poverty from the endemic problems that we have in this country that increase poverty. If we do it on the wrong baseline, you end up with the wrong answers. And so I'm loath to comment on a piece of documentation that I think is incorrect.
You think your own colleagues' work is incorrect?
The number they've come up is probably accurate, but it doesn't include all the factors. You can come up with a number. A number that you come up with depends on the question you ask. And the question that has been asked has been analysed on the basis that it doesn't include the major impacts on pensioners' income, which is the triple lock, the household support fund, and indeed the massive increase.
Which you've been disingenuous about.
Mr. Flynn.
There's tens of thousands of pensioners have been got themselves onto pension credit because of the massive increase in the advertising and the efforts that have been done by DWP. That is not included in those figures as an example. So I'm loath to comment on public policy on the basis of a figure that I deem to be not showing the true picture, an accurate picture of the whole platform and the whole matrix of the public policies that are in place for pensioners.
Thank you, Secretary of State. Can I just remind members they need to speak through the chair, and we'll wait for my permission to ask their question before they do so in future. Thank you. We're now going to move on to another question because we are running out of time. Thank you. And I'm going to move on to question number 8, Lillian Jones.
Back to me. So it's a two-pronged question. So really, why was it important for GB Energy to be headquartered in Scotland? And on the back of that, it's been reported that the GB Energy chair, Jürgen Mayer, will be based in Manchester and not in GB Energy's Aberdeen headquarters. And it was just to ask what message you think that sends about Scotland's role in delivering net zero?
Well, look, I think GB Energy is one of the best policies in our manifesto. I think it was really important for the legislation to be one of the first pieces of legislation into Parliament. Hopefully it will get well assent and be one of the first pieces of legislation out. Disappointed that the honourable gentleman who will actually host GB Energy didn't back it and didn't vote for it in the House, but the £125 million that was put forward in the budget to get GB Energy up and running is a commitment from the government to do this as quickly as possible. The ambitions to get to clean power by 2030 are tough. The NESO report says we can get there, but there are a number of hurdles that have to be swept away, and we're determined to do that. I think the two other things to be clear about is ultimately it's great that GB Energy is headquartered in Scotland. It's great that it's headquartered in Aberdeen. I think that sends out a very strong signal of Scotland's importance to delivering our manifesto commitments in the green energy mission. But the two things that fall from that is it's what GB Energy does, essentially, rather than what it is and what it's going to deliver, and that's really important. And the second thing is, all organisations have a board of directors, they have CEOs, they're all based in Aberdeen. The chair of many companies aren't necessarily in the place where the companies are headquartered. It's a non-executive role, but the key thing for the chair's role has already been around about the industry, talking to people, engaging stakeholders, and that's incredibly important because they're incredibly well respected across the whole of industry, and they very much welcomed the discussions that they've had with him already, and they will continue. And wherever you go in the world, as I said, the Scotland office went to Norway 2 weeks ago. We had a round table with energy companies. Norway is looking to Scotland, particularly on offshore floating wind, because we are the world leaders in this. This is a world race, and we don't just want to be part of that race, we want to win it, and we've got all the attributes to win it, and GB Energy is the catalyst for us to be able to do that.
Very much.
Just very briefly, and good morning to the committee. Really pleased to be here from the official side. Obviously, GB Energy is moving forward apace, but the wider movement of civil servants from London to be based as part of the Places for Growth programme, to be based around the UK, including Scotland, means that we have now over 100 DESNZ civil servants in Queen Elizabeth House in Edinburgh. So I think that the importance of having civil servants based in the communities for which they're making policy for is really important, and DESNZ are doing really excellent work in that regard in Edinburgh, which is really positive from my point of view.
That's great. Thank you very much for that additional information. That's helpful and good to know, actually. So just in terms of how many people we're expecting to be given jobs through GB Energy in Aberdeen, Edinburgh and Glasgow, so how many and what do we expect they'll be employed to do?
Well, I mean, I suppose ultimately the size of GB Energy as an organisation would be very much comparable with other bodies, probably 200 to 300, I would have thought. I would hope they'd be headquartered in Aberdeen, but of course will have to be based across the country, because we've heard from the honourable gentleman who represents some of the most rural communities in Scotland that they have to be on the ground delivering. So it will be investing in, generating, owning, being the catalyst for energy generation across the whole of the United Kingdom. But I suppose the key element here and the key principle is that delivering clean power by 2030 and getting to our net zero ambitions is going to be tough. We know it's going to be tough. But the biggest thing that this government has done is send out the message to the industry and to the world that not only is the UK open for business, but we're determined to deliver this. We're going to have a stable economic environment, but also a stable policy environment in terms of energy. And that's sent out a very strong signal. So those routes to market are actually the biggest thing that the government can do, and GB Energy's our legislative commitment to doing that, not only in practical terms delivering it, but sending out that very strong signal that this government is determined to get there, and takes away and draws a line under the previous government who were essentially all over the place on both energy policy and that economic platform, and therefore delivering anything would have been much more difficult.
Secretary of State.
Elaine.
Secretary of State, so I'm looking to find out what engagement took place with the Scottish Government before the introduction of the Great British Energy Bill.
Yes, well, the Cabinet Secretary for Energy, Gillian Martin, and Minister Shanks have worked very closely together. The Secretary of State, Ed Miliband, has also been working very closely with the Scottish Government. This is a major mission. One of the 5 missions of the UK Labour Government is to deliver that clean power by 2030. But all of that working together is to look at how you deliver that. So there's got to be very close working on consenting, on planning, and all the devolved areas that are required. It's actually a common Scottish Government agenda as well. If you look at some of the issues that I'm sure have been brought to you as a constituency member of, from inception to spades in the ground, can be decades, 14 years I think on average. We have to deliver 4 times as much energy infrastructure in the next 5 years that we've delivered in the last 30. So that's going to require both governments to work together. So the engagement has been very, very strong. Incredibly disappointed that the GB Energy Bill wasn't supported by representatives of the Scottish Government when it went through the House, because I think this is a key opportunity, not just for lower bills, not just for energy security, not just for our climate change requirements, but also for the jobs of the future. And I think this should be a national mission that we all get behind and try to deliver.
And what consultation has already taken place with Scottish Government on the GB Energy strategic priorities?
Well, there are active discussions. Maybe ones at official level could tell us what the format of those perhaps are. But the key thing here is that these are joint priorities. The Scottish Government also has very ambitious climate change targets. Obviously, they've just been diluted somewhat. We have to deliver this. This is about transition. It's about lowering people's bills, which is a huge issue across the country in terms of cost of living. If you look at what's been happening in the energy markets across Europe with the Ukraine and Russia, it's about energy security. It's about meeting our climate change commitments. But the key thing for communities all across Scotland, it's about those jobs and careers of the future, and that just transition away from an ageing basin in the North Sea. And that's a key thing this government has to deliver. We cannot have a situation like we've had in previous deindustrialisation where communities have been left behind, and GB Energy's goals to deliver that have to be done in conjunction with the Scottish Government.
I mean, just to add from my perspective, obviously the legislation, the setting up of GB Energy as an organisation is running at pace, but obviously fits in a wider system and framework of the government's net zero mission, which is obviously very aligned with the Scottish Government's. So, I mean, I think the collaboration you're seeing is real and extremely dynamic. The current consultation for consenting, which is planning is a devolved issue, but the legislation required to make it easier is actually UK-wide legislation, is a really good example, and that consultation is currently live. So from a ministerial level and an official level, both in IGR structures in due course, but also informally, I think you're seeing kind of you're seeing really excellent collaboration on the net zero space, where the two governments broadly share very similar objectives. So very positive from my point of view, but it's only a few months since the election. GB Energy has still got a lot of work to do to go from post-election to implementation.
I think they just answered my last question, which was about cooperation with Scottish Government to get to zero, net zero. So I think that was just answered for me.
Kirsty.
Thank you, Secretary of State. We're now going to move on to the question of Grangemouth. Now, the UK Government has said it will leave no stone unturned in seeking a future for Grangemouth, but you've also acknowledged that not all workers' jobs can be guaranteed, and I do appreciate it's a private endeavour. But can you tell me how many Grangemouth workers you still expect to be employed at site this time next year?
It's a great question, and it's been the number one issue that's been on our to-do list since within hours of taking office in terms of the issues at Grangemouth. I think it's really important at the start to separate the two issues out. There's the Grangemouth refinery and there's the Grangemouth site. So in answering your question about the site, it's really difficult to know. We do know there's 400 workers at the refinery, which obviously Petronas have announced will close in Q2 next year. But what the government have put in place is three things. There's a short-term strategy, a medium-term strategy and a longer-term strategy. The short-term strategy is to protect and do everything we possibly can to support the workers who will be losing their jobs at the refinery on the basis of that closure. That whole support is being put in place in conjunction again with the Scottish Government to make sure that they have the support that they require for retraining, reskilling, other jobs that may be on the site, etc. They're a hugely skilled workforce and something we should be making sure we try and protect as much as we can. The medium term is the growth deal, the Falkirk and Grangemouth growth deal. It was signed by the Deputy First Minister and I last Thursday at the wonderful Rosebank Distillery in the Falkirk constituency. An advert for them, go and see it if you can, it's fantastic. It's really good tours. That £100 million was originally an £80 million Falkirk and Grangemouth growth deal, £40 million from the Scottish Government and the UK Government, increased by £10 million each to deal with some of the issues in terms of the skills that will be required at a future Grangemouth site. And the longer term is Project Willow, which is an investment from the UK and Scottish governments to see what we should be doing with the much wider Grangemouth site as we move forward towards a decarbonised future. Project Willow should report the early part of next year. The Secretary of State at Desnes has given a commitment that the National Wealth Fund will look at some of the proposals in there to try and see if that can help the site transform. It's well documented the kind of things that may be in that project will the report, but we look forward to getting it. So that there's that short term, medium and long term. I suppose it's really worth saying that the Grangemouth site has a really bright future. Of course the refinery is devastating. It's something that we didn't want to happen, but has happened. I wish we had had more time in government to maybe try and do something about that, but the horse had bolted by the time that we took office. But we have put in place those short term, medium term and longer term proposals that I think gives the area in Grangemouth a much brighter future.
Thank you, Secretary of State, and thank you for making that important distinction between the refinery and the site. I think that is critical. Now, I'm aware of the skills and support package that has been developed, and that will help map current skills and qualifications to the future skills needed for local clean energy roles. With that in mind, and I don't want to preempt Project Willow, and I wouldn't put you in that position of asking you that question, but can I ask where you anticipate or expect workers will find the highly skilled, high quality jobs that we currently have?
Well, look, the oil and gas industry is an ageing industry. We know that it will decline and continue to decline, and has been for some years now. I think it's really important to say that oil and gas will be with us for decades to come, and we do require that world-class workforce to be able to make sure that we can have that active base in the North Sea, but also all the attached issues to it, including St Fergus and Grangemouth as being the centrepiece of that industrial heritage and industrial future in the Falkirk area. So it's really important for that to be stated, but we do have to have that transition in jobs. The GB Energy part of that is key. This has got to be a jobs-driven policy. And I think with Project Willow, look, I don't want to preempt what's in it either, but it doesn't take much to work out that it's got to be about what happens in the future. Sustainable aviation fuels have been spoken about a lot, clean chemicals. There's obviously the Acorn project, which feeds through the infrastructure at Grangemouth. So there's a whole host of things that Project Willow will be examining at the moment in terms of its practicality to deliver. But it's really important for government to set out clearly that we see that bright future for the Grangemouth site, and we want to do everything we possibly can to make sure it has that bright future. That's what Project Willow is designed to achieve. And I hope that the government, both governments being fully behind Project Willow, just means that we can send out the signal to both fledgling technologies like sustainable aviation fuels and the markets that Scotland can play a key part in the Grangemouth site of delivering that greener future.
Thank you. And my final question, I think you've partially answered it. The UK government, as you know, has been accused of having no plan for the Grangemouth closure. And as the UK moves towards net zero, can you tell me what steps you're taking to ensure that workers across Scotland's oil and gas sector are not placed in a similar position to those in Grangemouth?
Yeah, I mean, we inherited an industrial crisis at the election as well, right across Scotland, as well as a economic and public finances crisis. That industrial crisis has touched on pretty much everyone's constituencies, whether it be in oil and gas, Grangemouth, Mitsubishi Electric, Alexander Dennis Buses, Harland and Wolff. You know, the list has been unfortunately long, and the government have been fully committed to working through each of those to try and see what support we can give. So the key thing here is, though, to make that transition actually not just about words but about actions. GB Energy is part of that. I don't think anybody could deny the government's commitment to making sure that we can get that legislation in place and GB Energy up and running as quickly as possible, capitalise properly as well. So we've got to make sure that we have that transition. We've got to make sure that we say to the workforce, who are the world's best in terms of the work they do in oil and gas, that there are the jobs of the future they can transition across to. And it's incumbent on us to make sure we can generate those jobs and keep them here, manufacturing stuff here, making sure that we have as much on the ground in terms of that industrial base as possible, because we need to prove to them that they are the jobs of the future, but we also need to provide those jobs, because it's incumbent on us with a declining basin that we do so, and we want to keep those world-class skills here in the UK and in Scotland.
Lillian Jones.
Thank you. Myself again, Secretary of State. So these questions are on Brand Scotland, selling Brand Scotland to the world. I liked your quote. So just in terms of the budget, which has just been announced, Scotland Office received 750k to establish Brand Scotland. So in regards of your activities, what are they, and will they be set out in a strategy?
Yeah, the Brand Scotland strategy is being worked on at the moment. It'll have three major strands to it. It'll be about the trade missions that we committed to in the election campaign, so making sure that we're actually going out there working in conjunction with our DBT colleagues, our FCD colleagues and the Scottish Government to sell Scotland abroad. It'll be about inward investment as well, making sure that the world knows that Scotland's a great investable place, whether it be in shipbuilding, energy, some of the wonderful stuff that we produce, our financial services, our wider professional service industry, our cultural services, of course, and our cultural offering as well. And it also will be about trying to assist and work in partnership with other organisations that can help businesses export, whether they've not exported before, or whether they're fledgling exporters, or whether they want to grow exporting, and finding those networks. So partnering up with those as well. We have the most wonderful opportunity with our ambassadorial and mission network across the world to utilise them to make sure that Scotland is a key part of what they're doing as well, and that means working in conjunction with other departments to get more bang for a buck. So I'm really excited about the Brand Scotland thing. It's a real opportunity for us, and ultimately when you distill it all down, it's about jobs, it's about growth, and it's about making sure our communities in Scotland benefit from it.
Just on that, so HMRC is using figures value Scotland's exports at 31.9 billion this year. So is the 750,000 commensurate with existing and potential value of our Scottish exports? And just on the back of that as well, just a week and a double in there, you've probably answered this, but just to be clear, the Delivering for Scotland board, you said just earlier that you've had a recent meeting with them, so will that board be continuing?
Yes, and actually the Deliver for Scotland board, I suspect, I'm not quite sure I've told Laurence this yet, but we may have specific boards now on our key 4 priorities of the Scotland office. One of them, of course, being Brand Scotland, which may or may not be the next one that we do in terms of getting. Has been in the past, it's not necessarily a criticism, it's probably just happened subconsciously that, you know, something comes up internationally about Scotland and it gets put in a sort of Scotland box and somebody else will do that, but I think it's about cross-government, making sure that every government department's helping this. So the £750,000, yes, is the money we got out of the Treasury, but actually it's worth much more than that. And if you compare that, as you've done, to the £31.9 billion of exports, actually what we want to be doing with that £750,000 is working with other government departments, levering in more money, making sure Scotland's open for business, bringing in inward investment and helping people to export even more. So we want that £31.9 billion to grow, because growing that means it's jobs in your constituency and mine.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. Thank you, Secretary of State.
We're now moving on to Susan Murray.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to move the subject to how Scotland is funded by the UK Government. The Scottish Government is well within its limit for resource borrowing, but remains close to its cap on investment. Are borrowing limits for resource set high enough?
Well, look, I mean, let me just reflect on the budget that's just passed.
Too high.
Yeah, when the Chancellor got to her feet on the 30th of October, to the time she sat down, Scotland was better off to the tune of £4.9 billion. That is the largest single settlement in devolution's history. I think we should celebrate that, and I think it shows a direction of travel from this UK Labour government, that we want to invest in our public services, we want that money spent on the front line, we wanted to invest in growth in our priorities, and we want it invested in the people of Scotland. So that £4.9 billion is a considerable amount of money and a considerable commitment, and delivered not without pain because of the other issues that have had to happen in the budget in order to stabilise the economy, fill the £22 billion black hole, and provide that investment to get our public services off their knees. So that's a huge commitment. So I would hope that money is now spent on the front line. I hope it's now spent sensibly, and I hope it's spent to make sure that we can improve our public services and deliver the growth that Scotland requires for those jobs of the future. And that would be my overall aim. So in terms of other issues around the fiscal framework and the caps and resource borrowing requirements, etc., there is now an awful lot of money in the pot to be spent, and we need to make sure all of us collectively spend that for the benefit of the people of Scotland.
Chair, may I come in on that point? Thank you, Chair. The Scottish Government's budget will obviously come after the UK Labour Government, and as the Secretary of State has mentioned, the UK Labour Government has pledged record levels, historic levels of funding for Scotland, with a £5 million boost to the block grant, and in my opinion the UK Government has really changed the financial weather. Therefore, does the Secretary of State agree with me that hopefully this will prompt a change of direction by the Scottish Government, that a different path is possible? And does he hope that the funding will be used to tackle NHS waiting lists? 1 in 6 Scots are on NHS waiting lists. Does he hope that a different path is possible in relation to the performance of our education system and the number of homes built across Scotland with this record funding?
Well, look, the beauty of devolution is it's up to the Scottish Government to spend the money in the ways in which they wish to spend it. We do have some commitments, of course, on education being one. There will be some money going in directly from the VAT on private school fees will be spent on education. So there has been some discussions already around and some commitments made. I do reflect on the Institute for Fiscal Studies report that said that most of the financial problems that the Scottish Government currently have as a result of the decisions that they have made, and therefore that then leads to the answer to your question, that we hope the decisions that they are made at the Scottish Government level in terms of their budget reflect the challenges that you've set out in your question that are currently both in our public services and in our economy, and those challenges need to be met head on, because we can't afford for this massive opportunity in terms of that funding to be wasted.
Just one other point round about the drawdown limit on the Scotland Reserve. They have been removed, but there's still a cap of 700 million. Do you think this goes far enough to provide sufficient flexibility to protect Scotland from future economic volatility?
I wouldn't want to open up a discussion about the fiscal framework in this committee. Maybe it would be a very long inquiry that you might want to start yourself, because it's hugely complex. But there was a fiscal framework review before the election that concluded. I think it doubled the allocation that was required or was allowed for resource borrowing at the request of the Scottish Government. So of course there has to be balancing mechanisms in place in terms of the way the Scottish budget operates. But a lot of these issues that come up in terms of borrowing and in terms of the fiscal framework really are much diluted if the block grant in the £47.7 billion, which was massively increased at the budget, is in place. That's now the baseline budget, of course, so that is now in place for the future. And we have the second phase of the spending review, which will conclude in April. So, it's really important that these kinds of issues are much more pronounced when there's less money around, and the budget has delivered that £4.9 billion, which is a huge increase in the Scottish Government's budget, and therefore I would think that some of these fiscal framework issues that have been around for a long time will become less of an issue.
Angus, you've got some questions.
Thank you very much. Secretary of State, the hospitality sector and the retail sector are massive in the more remote parts of Scotland, particularly all the way up the west coast, the north coast 500, etc. It's the biggest sector. Tourism is the biggest sector in the Highlands. On the face of it would seem to be quite strong. The reality is that the school rolls at, say, Gairloch School have more than halved, and that is the same all the way down the west coast. So we're seeing a massive movement of people towards the cities and a depopulation. The hospitality industry, and just to disclose myself, I am in the hospitality industry in a way in Fort William. The hospitality industry is completely on its knees, and we have had, for example, we haven't had the 75% break on business rates for hospitality and retail in the Highlands, in Scotland rather. And so for a business which I'm very involved in, that is costing us £40,000, which would not cost us that money in England. Your national insurance increase in the budget is an 8.7% increase. Hospitality employ young people. So very often people, it's their first job, they come straight out of school. And so the businesses I'm involved in are having a 12.7% increase when you take into account the increases of pay for the younger people in particular. So my question to you is, I don't know if you guys consider what is happening in the Scottish Parliament when increases like this go through, but increasing the payroll cost by 12.7%, which is 5 times inflation, is absolutely catastrophic. And I can tell you it is bringing the tourism industry on the west coast absolutely down on its knees. And I wondered if that was considered before that increase went through.
It's a multifaceted...
Before you continue, I'm glad you made your declaration of interest at the beginning, Angus. I'm not sure it was as obvious as perhaps you intended it to be, so I'll just draw attention to it for you.
Thank you.
Secretary of State.
It's a multifaceted question, and there's lots of answers to it, but let me go to pay first of all. It was the largest increase in the national living wage, but the right thing to do, because we have a situation in this country whereby most 70% of people who have a connection with the welfare system are in work. One or both of the households with children are in work, and therefore we have a problem with pay in this country, and therefore making sure that people are paid properly and paid decently for a good day's work is actually where we should be as a government, and I'm very proud of the fact that we will get there. And that disproportionately affects Scots and Scottish workers, because a larger majority were on lower pay and indeed 0 hours contracts, etc. So there's that side of it. The second thing is in terms of employers' national insurance contributions. Look, somebody had to pay for the budget, and it was all these decisions were difficult. And the criticisms of the budget from various quarters are that everyone wants the benefits of the budget, as we've been talking about, but nobody wants the pain. And with every budget that is having to do some difficult things, stabilising the economy, filling a £22 billion black hole, when the Chancellor got to her feet, she started on minus £22 billion. So had to fill that, and then resolve everything else, and therefore I think the budget that she delivered in the Scottish context was transformational in that sense, setting aside the previous question in terms of how that money is now spent. So the issues around rural hospitality are ones that are key. We meet with the hospitality organisations all the time, and that's again multifaceted. It's about housing, access to public services, depopulation, and we have to resolve some of those big issues in terms of how we do that. But if I reflect on your first question, there's great opportunities. When we visited Shetland, we got off the plane and we went all the way up to the spaceport in northern Unst, in the island of Unst, and the opportunities are just there for all to see. And for rural communities, those opportunities in energy, in the future technologies around space, which are really prevalent to rural industries, are really exciting. But we can only capture those and develop those and maximise those opportunities if we get the infrastructure right. So all of that needs to feed into that. So whether it be the school rules, the depopulation, the difficulties with the hospitality industry, and one small reflection, Madam Chair, if I may, the budget did permanently put in place a 40% reduction in rates in England and Wales for hospitality businesses. That's not reflected in Scotland, and has put a significant amount of pressure on the hospitality industry, who feel they've been disadvantaged, and I hope that the Scottish Government reflect on that disadvantage. But they, as I've said already, are completely responsible for spending their own money, and that's the way devolution works, and they're right to do so.
Just to follow up on that, I hugely hope that the Scottish Government do listen to that on business rates relief, because it's incredibly important. In July, in your first statement, you spoke about three things: driving economic growth, creating jobs, and reducing poverty. I'm afraid that on the west coast of Scotland particularly, that this budget will actually result in a lot less jobs and will drive people out of the area. And things like that national insurance increase are devastating. So I'm afraid you did hear it from me first, but it is really, really painful. Thank you.
There is pain in the budget, as I've already said, and we understand that, but we had to make some tough decisions, make lots of tough decisions in order to try and set the economy on the direction of travel which will benefit your constituents and the rural areas in the short, medium and longer term. And I mean, I don't
increasing corporation tax. Increased corporation tax would have done the job and hit the profits of profitable companies. This hits charities, it hits small businesses. It just clobbered everybody.
We had a manifesto commitment not to increase corporation tax above the 25% that it's currently at, to give that economic stability for businesses right across the country. That's the right thing to do, because, you know, with all due respect to the Honourable Gentleman, we've been in power since July. The last 14 years are going to be difficult to turn around. We need time to do that, but there's going to be some tough decisions. We've got a lot of mess to clear up in fixing those foundations of the economy. The budget, I hope, was the direction of travel the government wants to go in, and everyone has had to put a little bit into the pot in order for us to be able to deliver that. And I hope that the economic future is much brighter for the country, which will benefit all the businesses in this constituency.
Thank you, Chair. Just on the subject of the budget, I think everybody in the room would welcome the substantial uplift there has been in the budget for Scotland. However, I was greatly troubled to hear the First Minister make a statement to say that a lot of the money had already been spent. Can I ask if he made you aware beforehand that instead of investing this money in public services, investment that's badly needed, did he make you aware that he would plug the gap in the Scottish Government's finances, the black hole that the Scottish Government has had for so many years?
I'll just refer committee members to the Institute for Fiscal Studies report that says that the Scottish Government's budget problems are as a result of the decisions that they've made in large part. And those are political decisions that are made. They have every right to make them. They have the mandate from the electorate to make them. But what is clear is that the way in which that gap has been filled, in terms of £500 million of cuts, and indeed selling or using the money from this capital money from the Scotland licences, £500 million, which is supposed to be about investing in the future to plug revenue gaps, is not sustainable. And I think that unsustainability are showing that the chickens are now coming home to roost, because you cannot continue to use one-off funding to plug revenue gaps, because that ultimately ends up with an empty cupboard at the end of the period in which the money runs out. So we need that money invested into the budget, and we've just had a discussion about where the money's come from. If people have other ideas about where the money should be coming from, I'm very happy to hear them, but everybody wants the benefits of this budget, but nobody wants to pay for it. And unless we fix the foundations of the economy, then I would expect to be appearing in front of this committee in future months and years, having to explain the decisions of the government in terms of why the economy hasn't been stabilised and why it's affecting all of our constituents.
Very, very short question, Mr Flynn.
Oh, of course, thank you, Chair. Prior to the election, Secretary of State, it was reported that you wanted to turn the Scotland office into a proper spending department with financial clout. Indeed, it was said that over 150 million will be given directly to your office to dole out north of the border. I appreciate that those weren't your words, but you did, of course, share those newspaper stories on your own social media account. When do you expect that £150 million to be doled out from the Scotland office?
Well, £150 million is not my figure, but we've done three things already. Firstly, the £750,000 for Brand Scotland essentially effectively turns us into a de facto spending department, because we have to spend that money on the Brand Scotland issues. There was £1.4 billion in the budget for the regional growth in Scotland, projects across Scotland and in everyone's constituency. In fact, I think there might be 100 or so million in the Aberdeen area for your own constituencies as well, and those local growth projects are key to that. And the second stage of the spending review, which happens in April, is where we're taking the discussions forward about the next 3 years. So we've started that process and we'll continue that process, and it's a very exciting time for the Scotland Office for the whole host of reasons that we're delivering for Scotland.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. And we've really come to the end of our formal questions. I have one final question to ask, but it's more of a request than a question. The previous committee had conducted 2 inquiries which were cut short because of the general election and it being called ahead of when anyone expected it, I think, or most people expected it. Those were on the Scottish space, which you referred to yourself, and also the science sectors. I think the committee wrote to the Scotland office, it'd be really lovely to have a response to those 2 letters at some point, just so that we can finish off the work of the last committee, in effect.
But may I, very happy to respond to those. May I ask for the current committee to just refresh that letter and send it back to us, if that's possible, on the basis that the current government don't have access to the previous government's issues, but I'm very happy to respond. And just on the space, I was in the Space Expo, spoke at the Space Expo in Glasgow back in October, and visited the spaceport in Ernst. So the space sector is hugely important to us in the Scotland office, and we want to nurture that and develop it. It's a great opportunity for Scotland, so very happy to respond to those.
Thank you very much, and we will make sure you get copies of those letters. So can I, on behalf of the committee, thank all of our panel today. Baroness Cluny, it was very interesting to hear your explanation, and it was very helpful to have you here to answer questions. We hope we'll see you again in the near future. Obviously, Secretary of State, Ms McNeill, we look forward to having regular dialogue with you over the piece, and we will no doubt feed back to you about the inquiries that we are going to undertake. And thank you very much to Mr Rockey for adding additions to some of the answers, which were very helpful to have too. So thank you all very much.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.
Order. We now conclude the meeting, but we will